morning. Thank you for coming, and it's great to see almost a full room in spite of the strikes today, and I'm sure not a single picket line was crossed. But that said, we are still waiting for one more panellist. He actually works next door, so that may explain why he's not here yet. But in the meantime, we have Anna Garcia from the Big Data Value Association. We have Bill Eshikson from SEPS, and we have Christina Moran-Andreasen from the Danish Permanent Representation. And we're here to discuss a report that we at the Centre for Data Innovation have been working on for about a year now. It's a very good report, ranking the EU member states and how they perform on data innovation. And as you can see, I've put copies of the report on all of the chairs, and there are spares at the side as well for anybody who comes in and isn't able to get a chair, because that could happen today. The top ranking country is Denmark, which I'm pleased to say is represented on the panel. When I invited Christine to join the panel, I was still working on the final numbers, so I wasn't yet certain that Denmark was going to be number one. So Finland was very close, but once we finalised the scores, Denmark came out on top. And of course we've got Finland, the Netherlands, Sweden and the UK. Now we'll get into those in more detail in the discussion. But to give kind of a very quick overview of this report, we've divided this into three sections: data, technology and people and firms. The data section is looking at the availability of data that can be reused for useful purposes, whether they be economically useful or socially useful. So we've looked at open data, we've looked at companies supplying data as a service, and we've looked at freedom of information laws. We've also looked at factors that can inhibit the flow of data, like libel chill, for example, that we found was a big problem in the EU. And I should add that this is actually the second of a report in a series that we've done. We did another version of this in the United States, where we looked at very similar indicators. So if you want to compare the EU and the US, you couldn't do it in terms of rankings, but if you take a look at both reports, you can see how they compare on some of these indicators. The technology section looks at a lot of infrastructure. It looks at broadband internet connections in households and businesses. It looks at the Internet of Things, and we do that by looking at smart meters. We look at smart cities, and at smart ticketing in transport systems. And the people and firms section is largely about skills and about their use in business. So we look at digital skills, we look at data science, education, and we look at the use of data-driven technologies in businesses, like customer relationship management software and these types of things. So all in all, we've got about, I think it's 32 indicators in this report. So yeah, it's been a lot of work, and we're very proud of it, and we're very pleased to present it to you today. I also didn't introduce myself. I often forget to do that on panels. My name is Nick Wallace. I'm a senior policy analyst at the Centre for Data Innovation. I am based here in Brussels, and the Centre is a global think tank headquartered in Washington, DC, and we are focused on policies that encourage the best uses of data for social uses and for economic uses. And with that, I think I'm just going to dive straight into the questions. I didn't want to waste time on having individual presentations from every panelist, but of course, if there's anything you've sort of come in mind that you want to say, feel free. And if anybody in the audience at any point wants to shout anything out and ask a question, please just put your hand up. I will give you the opportunity. And we will also have half an hour at the end for questions from the floor as well. But if you're really bursting and you can't wait until then and you're worried about the debate moving on, please don't hesitate to put your hand up. So as I've already said, Denmark is number one, and I'm sure Christine and her colleagues are very pleased about that. The indicators that are behind that are all in the report, the numbers that have put Denmark up there. So I'm not going to ask about that. What I am going to ask about is the policy and maybe even the politics of Denmark, and also the other leading countries, particularly Finland and Sweden. that it's put it at the top. So what is it about Danish policy making that has helped that country to take the lead, and what does it have in common with Finland and Sweden, which also is very high? I'll start with Christina.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Nick, for the invitation, and thank you for the report and big congratulations. Very extensive, very impressive work. I haven't stayed up all night and read it through cover to cover yet. I will, of course, at one point. But yeah, happy to see the report, not only because we come out in the #1 ranking, which we're, of course, very happy about, but also because it's a super important topic, and a topic that's increasingly important, and that we spend a lot of time and energy on in Denmark. So to say a few words about what we do, as you say, some of the indicators say what has already been done and the state of play. I can say a few words about what we're doing from the Danish side at the moment, and possibly later on what we then see is also necessary to do at an EU level, of course. But so we're a small country which has a lot of effect. I think we've over many years now become one of the most digitized societies, which is a really good starting point, but we try to be mindful not to go into sort of a, let's say, complacency trap and be satisfied with ourselves. One thing that I learned is that we did a survey not very long ago in Denmark, and it shows that 7 out of 10 Danish companies actually still experience barriers that prevent them from using data in their work, and this is especially hard-hitting for the SMEs who are lagging behind in the use of data, big data, IoT. So this is something that concerns us quite a lot. So we try from the government side to push ahead and be sort of take the lead on some things. We do believe that public institutions should actively promote the use of data, make more public data available, improve the quality of data, and work actively to break down the silos that I think are very predominant in every government setting, so that we can enable this sharing. We do put a lot of emphasis also on the public and private sector working together. We've recently launched an open data partnership between the municipalities, the regions, something called Open Data DK, and our government body on this. So just to provide an overview of what do we have in terms of public data, what are the relevant sources, how can they be made publicly available, and raise awareness in general about the potential of open data. So we're also going to present a new digital growth strategy later this fall. And a lot of the elements will be how to make, maintain the sort of digital front runner, not only image, but of course also being a digital front runner itself. One last initiative that I would mention is that we also recently appointed the first ever tech ambassador. So we have now an ambassador who's going to be based in Silicon Valley, has a global mandate, and the idea behind the tech ambassador is that he will spend a lot of time sort of understanding where are we, let's say 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now on artificial intelligence and a number of developing technologies, and sort of try to bring that knowledge back to Denmark in dialogue with think tanks, big and small business, and everyone who's an actor in this area, so that we can sort of try to put, on the front of this development as much as we can. So this is a long answer, but yeah.
It's good. There's a couple of points in there that I'll pick up on a little bit later on. Before I move on, does anybody else want to say anything about Denmark? Or about any of the other countries in the top 5? Is that a nod or a... because Christina mentioned developing technology. You mentioned artificial intelligence specifically as well. And the other question I wanted to ask was what uses of data or of data-driven technologies are going to be the most important in the digital economy, and how well prepared is Europe to take advantage of them? I'll start with Bill.
Let me ask you a question first before we go to so I have to speak. I get to speak less. But you mentioned that you've done a similar report in the United States. How was the comparison? Because that I didn't see before.
So we didn't benchmark Europe against the US.
Okay. So it's apples and oranges.
Not quite, because in both cases we've looked at things like broadband speed, IoT rollout, but we've had to use different indicators in order to, different raw indicators in order to get those. For example, in this report, we've used sort of a kind of a triangulated it from smart meters, smart cities, and smart ticketing. In the US, we had, I think it was just smart meters data, but the smart meters data that we had was much more accurate. We had very specific data on the rollout of, I can't remember which smart metering service it was across the country, but I would say certainly if you go and read both reports, you could get an indication. To give, this is one of the more, let's say, esoteric indicators we used, and this one is safeguards against libel chill. And in the US, we looked at that as anti-SLAPP laws. So a SLAPP is a strategic lawsuit against public participation. But the two amount to the same thing, which is essentially that where you have the threat of litigation deterring people from putting information online, which may either contain data or more likely it becomes part of a stream of data. So if you think about reviews on websites like Yelp and TripAdvisor and this kind of thing, the specific issue we were looking at in the US was where the threat of libel action was discouraging people from writing bad restaurant reviews, for example. And a lot of states passed anti-SLAPP laws to try and deal with that. Now in the EU, where the legal systems are much more varied across the 28 member states, you can't look for a specific measure like an anti-SLAPP law, because that's where states are trying to solve a problem that they all have in common and that they're all trying to solve in the same way. So here we looked at a wider set of indicators. We looked at, we ran a set of questions on, does the law prohibit this or does the law allow this? So whether, for example, the truth is an absolute defense in a libel case was one issue we looked at. We looked at whether there were special protections for certain types of people from being insulted or these type of things. And we also looked at the cost of going to court, which is a huge factor as well. And the result is we get what we hope is a kind of a similar indicator, but drawn from different evidence.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's interesting. I would, before I start speaking about it in general, I think the same difference you would see offline as well as online, because I wrote a book on French wine, published in the United States, sued for libel in France. And libel laws and the amount of backlash you get, or what you can say in public or in writing, is much more circumscribed in Europe than it is in the United States. And the libel laws were, there was absolutely no case in the United States. I had not intended, I would have had to be proved to have intended to have defamed someone intentionally. And in France, it was just a case of getting a fact wrong in a 300-page book, or the person in question didn't like what he had read to be convicted or at least sued. So I think that these changes are long-term, or the difference is cultural.
I forgot to mention that was one. I mean, it's a fairly small indicator. We didn't weight it too heavily in the final results, but that was one indicator where I would say the results in the EU are quite depressing, and that there are a handful of countries where there do seem to be very strong protections against malicious libel suits.
Well, I mean, and more, we're going to face more pressure to crack down on speech with fake news and extremist ideologies, but I mean, and to use your TripAdvisor explanation, that gets to my fear about Europe of over-regulation, because there are workshops that DG Connect is now holding where they basically go to the restaurant owners of TripAdvisor or the hotel owners of Booking and say, do you have a problem? And they say, either I haven't finished first or I didn't like that review. And they're thinking of ways in which to rebalance or give the unhappy restaurant owner his due. And I think that many of us are waiting for that to come out at the end of the year to see exactly how Europe will try to regulate restaurant reviews, should we say. Now, let me start with the good news, okay? So we're good. In the year that I've been running the digital forum at CEPS, I mean, I think there's been a real, the first event I did was a talk by a VC firm called Atomico. They put out a report every year, and the news for Europe is very, very good. I mean, Europe is producing startup after startup. Cities such as London, of course, have a Silicon Valley aspect, but even now we're seeing Paris, Berlin become hotbeds. They showed that even they were seeing an uptick in places as far flung as Lisbon, or I mean, obviously Helsinki, but Lithuania, and so forth. So it's spreading, the sort of startup culture is spreading throughout Europe. The bad news, and you can go on our website to find the figures, or go to Atomico. And I think there's a similar study done by a VC firm called First Ventures. So they're upping their spending and finding Europe a really interesting place to invest. The difficulty that people are having is going from that first stage to the real second stage, where you get the funding of several hundred million euros and grow from a 20-person firm to a 2,000-person firm. I think that's where Europe still faces a challenge. And I think one of the reasons that that's being held back is fragmentation in the market. You don't really still have a 500 million people continent digital single market, despite the attempt by the European Commission. And in fact, I think you're seeing the real question of overregulation. So if we take data, I think that, again, there's really important signs that most of the Google, Facebook, artificial intelligence research is being done here in Europe, a lot of it. London, Google bought DeepMind. Zurich is where they also have a big center of artificial intelligence research. But many of the European companies that are really ahead in this don't talk about it or seem to hide. I remember trying to talk to Bosch or Siemens, and they're doing cutting-edge research, but they won't tell you that in public because of fear of getting a backlash. And then I think there's the overall regulatory environment, which is discouraging because, one, I don't think we've created a digital single market. I think we've fragmented it more over the last couple of years. To give you two examples that I often use, if you're on WhatsApp or Skype, you had really a single European market because there are no differences between Finland or France. If we go with the telecom proposals that are on the table now, essentially they will have to rely or report to 28 different, soon to be 27 different national telecom regulators. Another example would be video streaming, where Netflix could run everything out of the Netherlands, home country, and then serve the entire market. Under the new broadcasting regulation, it will have to subsidize local production and pay or respect content quotas in every European country. So I think that's the fragmentation that I fear is accentuating rather than being smoothed over. And when it comes to data, the big question really are the new privacy rules. And I think everyone is spending a lot of time preparing for the GDPR, to use the acronym, that is expected to come into effect in next May. And at the same time, there's a new privacy regulation just for communications devices that is being debated that often contradicts these new rules and certainly at least adds a lot of complexity. And it's, although designed, the e-privacy law, for just communications, the way it's defined now, it takes any website with any messaging ability and says that that is under the scope, and therefore you have to respect both GDPR and potentially a very different e-privacy regulation. So I think despite the best efforts of, let's say, the Estonian presidency or the Estonian vice commissioner, often Europe is moving backwards on these questions of regulating the internet and unleashing the data. I know that I've heard often the response that this will give Europe a competitive advantage because Europe's data rules will be exported to the rest of the world and will make European companies much more competitive because they'll appeal to consumers because they'll be respecting privacy. But until now, the only company that's come to me and said, I'm really working on GDPR compliant software is a one-person firm out of London, a former Google colleague who left the search team and has started and has a new piece of software but has no funding for it. So I don't know how true that is, and I think that's a good place to end because I think there really is opportunities here. The report shows that countries can take advantage of data, can grow the economy. We can talk about the impact on labor markets as well. I think this is going to be net positive for the countries that embrace it. There is evidence that shows more jobs being created by the internet than being destroyed. But at the same time, I'm not sure that Europe will be able to take full advantage if it over-regulates data.
So you mentioned a couple of things in there, including some of the regulatory issues that I was trying to ask about. One of the indicators that we would have really liked to get, but we couldn't find for this report, was on the use of AI. Probably because it's still very early days. The technology's still taking off, but it would have been, for example, we included data on the use of CRM and ERP software in companies. What would have been great was it would have been if we'd been able to find CRM software driven by AI and ERP software driven by AI, which is becoming popular now. But I think despite the fact that it's clearly such early days that we couldn't get data on its use, it already seems to be provoking some anxiety. And I wouldn't just say in Europe, I would say specifically in Brussels, if I'm allowed to make the distinction. And you mentioned the GDPR, and there are some provisions on AI in there already. It doesn't actually explicitly refer to AI, but there is I think it's referred to as profiling. So this is the right to explanation in Articles 12 and 13, or 13 and 14. So I think what I'd like to ask, and I'll put this to Anna because I also want to give you an opportunity to talk about the uses of data that you think are valuable, but would you say that there is perhaps, in the face of value that you spend your job looking for, the value of data, do you think there is perhaps also too much pessimism and anxiety in Brussels sometimes about good use of data, particularly AI? And do you think there is anything that we can do to kind of calm the debate down a little bit?
So thank you, Nick. Just let me do a quick introduction of myself, mainly because I come in replacing someone else, so everybody knows a bit who I am and I speak on behalf of whom. So I'm the Secretary General of the Big Data Value Association, and that's a European industry-driven association more in the research and innovation part. And we really joined forces with the European Commission to create this big data value public-private partnership, and really to try to accelerate data-driven innovation in Europe, but always from the pre-commercial side, more in the research and innovation part, and defining roadmaps and tools that can help industry and research to really provide or accelerate the usage of data. So I will answer the question also by commenting a bit on the previous interventions, because I think we can really create a story. First, I'm very optimistic always, even when, so I need to, we are optimistic where this is taking us, because this is something that we cannot stop. So we need to be optimistic and we need to find the best ways to make this happen. And that's the reason also why, even when, for instance, in our community, we work very much from the technology perspective, we are very much focused in everything that has to be with trust, transparency, etc. But let me tackle first in relation to these barriers for creating value. I was very surprised when you said, as you know, the first country in the ranking, and you said 7 over 10 companies, they really have reported challenges and barriers in the usage of data. And then if we go to SMEs, it's much, much higher. So I think this is a very good indicator that at the moment there are a lot of barriers, you mentioned regulatory barriers for sure, but there are many. There are also know-how. One of the main issues that we have found out is with the data economy. We are talking about new businesses, new business models, with new ways of really, you know, it's not just we are here, we move to the same business, same value chain, but just we use data, we digitalize everything. No, it's not that. It's just because the whole value chain changes, and the whole way different players give data, use data, transform data. That's something that is still, we need to think about what the different business models will come out of this data economy. Also skills, and it's very good that you include it in your report, a lot of things, a lot of data about the skills. So there are many, many barriers that are now really stopping for this to happen. And then you were talking about the scaling. So we have a good number of data entrepreneurs in Europe, but it's true that there are barriers to scale. And of course, everything that has to be with cross-collaboration in between countries, with different regulations, with access to other national ecosystems, etc. That's something where we need to put a lot of effort to mainly, to go and step beyond. And about your question, a specific question again on pessimistic or optimistic, definitely the challenge of the artificial intelligence, that's the main challenge that comes now with data, is huge. It's very big. And we need to talk a lot about that. We need to talk at the national level, a European level, local level, because it's something that is going to affect the lives of everyone. So, but I think we need to look at it from a positive perspective. There are many governments that are launching initiatives related to trust and transparency in data, in algorithms, to really develop more trust in the usage of artificial intelligence. I think that's necessary, that debate is necessary, but from the optimistic perspective, not pessimistic, because I don't think this is something that we can stop.
Christina, did you have something to add to that?
Well, yes, I think it's, I just wanted to jump in on the optimist-pessimist sort of, let's say, debate that we started now, because I do actually share a lot of the optimism that Anna put forward, and I wanted to just say a few words about, let's say, the concern that Bill raised about, let's say, over-regulation and fragmentation of the digital single market, which is what we're all working on at the moment. And it is a work in progress. We're definitely not there. I think we passed around 6 pieces of legislation in a total of 14, but 16, and then a number of non-legislative, of course. But so that's where we are. We're working very hard, both in the Council and in Parliament, to sort of pass all this. And of course, we absolutely have to get it right. And coming from a country that always, let's say, champions a better regulation, let's look carefully at the evidence of actually going in to regulate. Is there a case to do that? And always, let's say, cautious in that sense. I do still think there is some reason to say, okay, Europe is regulating at a, let's say, I'm going to say innovative way. I think the GDPR is one example. I think everyone, especially some American friends, said, if pass GDPR, you know, it's going to break all trade, Europe is going to get killed on innovation and so forth. And I mean, let's see when it enters into force, but I do think it will be a case for a higher standard of privacy protection. I share some concerns on the e-privacy. I won't get into that here, but just to say, we did pass roaming, portability, a number of good legislations that has a really big impact for businesses and for consumers already now. A proposal just put forward that was very, very important to us, and that we, from the Danish side, along with a number of other member states, worked very hard to have put forward this initiative on free flow of data, which is something that we see is hugely important, not least as this, let's say, a simple value that member states will not be allowed to come up or maintain data localization requirements going forward. So this, for us, is also a very positive signal. So just to
No,
come back
I
on
think
the...
I could have spent and should have spent more time going through those issues and those positives, especially the free flow of data, which I think, you know, if you look around the globe, we're seeing more and more data localization measures and more countries that are insisting, Russia, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, that the stuff stay inside their national borders. So I think more, you know, that move of free flow of data is very, very important.
And we
as a
absolutely
symbol.
need it in like the global sphere of trade agreements and so forth. It's just as important.
And you are right. I think the GDPR will become the global standard of privacy protection, because I see it being companies taking global rules based on the GDPR, and other countries searching for adequacy ruling, be it Japan, Israel, which I think already has it, but there's a long lineup. So yes, I mean, what is happening here is definitely the front lines of internet regulation, and it is setting the world standards in many ways. And you're right to point to roaming and the other efforts to really break down barriers. But there are a lot of examples of, on privacy, with the e-privacy and GDPR, sort of the very notion of, or the need for the regulation seems unclear to me.
I would like just to comment and reinforcing the message that what we see from industry in relation to GDPR and looking more from the technology provider is really a good opportunity to really become front runners in providers of privacy and privacy preserving solutions for the rest of the world. And,
as I've said, I've seen only a one-person firm come to me with some solution, and I've seen
there
lots
are
of lawyers and accountants.
There are actually a lot of, and there are a lot of companies from outside Europe coming to Europe, actually with solutions for privacy preserving and these kind of things. And there is a good pop-up of solutions from a lot of SMEs and also large companies that are getting prepared for this. And I think there is a lot of positive excitement in the opportunities from the business perspective that this will bring to European industry. That's what we...
You mentioned new business models. There does seem to be a new business model emerging in consultants who are giving advice to companies on how to comply with the GDPR.
Or law firms who become chief privacy officers and so forth. Not, I think, the type of innovation that you were thinking of.
No, but it's a new business model of sorts. You mentioned data localization, but I'll come back to that a little bit later. I wanted to change the theme a little bit. We could bridge it because, I mean, you know, we have the Estonian presidency of the council now, and the free flow data is something that Estonia's been pushing for a while. And Estonia also stands out in this report. It's in 6th place, and you'll notice through each chapter we've mostly focused on the top 5. But the reason I say Estonia stands out is it is the only post-communist country in Europe that gets even into the top half of the scores. And it also ranks number 1 in the data category. And you'll notice, I mean, one of my concerns was, and before I even collected the data, I thought something like this might happen, is that the top 5 are all very rich countries. and obviously having money to spend doesn't hurt, having money to invest doesn't hurt, but there actually isn't that much correlation between the final score and income. It's about 0.49, I think, and Estonia shows that Europe's, some of the relatively lower income countries in Europe can outperform much wealthier countries. So it's way above Germany, it's above Spain, it's above France, it's above Belgium, Ireland, Austria, Luxembourg. It's above all of these countries. So one question I'd like to ask, and it's a shame we don't have anyone from the Estonian Perm Rep on the panel. I don't know whether there's anyone from Estonia in the room. But what is the secret of that country, and what lessons might it have for other Central and Eastern European countries that for the most, well, entirely have fallen behind in these rankings? I'm going to start with Bill, because I know that in addition to having written a book about French wine, you wrote a book about Central and Eastern Europe. And
There wasn't no
There's a long time
defamation,
ago.
no defamation suit on that one. Well, first of all, it's near Denmark, so that's one reason I think that Estonia has succeeded in leapfrogging. And I think that the geographic proximity to a lot of the Nordic countries, because you see they score in general very, very high on open data and transparent government and so forth. So, I mean, I think more generally, beyond that, I think Estonia was never got stuck with old technology and leapfrogged into the new technologies, and definitely has a government that is promoting this, which is, I think, very important. But I think in general what we're seeing in Europe is that the fringe countries, or at least geographically, the Benelux, Ireland, the Nordics, the Baltics, really see the internet as something that's going to promote their economy, that's going to boost it. It gives them a chance to either catch up or move further ahead. And it's more in Central Europe, in Southern Europe, where there's hesitations, and that's why Brexit, I think, in this balance is very important. It weakens the sort of pro-internet camp. And it's, in many times, Christine will be in council, I think later she'll find that Big Four is leading the skepticism and wants to regulate more. That's a broad brush, but you have France, Germany, Spain, and Italy who either haven't done as well with the internet or are more frightened by it in some ways. I think what happens now with in France would be very important, Mr. Macron, because he seems to at least change the tone of the debate and sees the internet as something that is going to help France revive itself. We'll see if that comes out. I think in the free flow of data debate, it was interesting that my impression was that France was blocking it and then sort of switched, or at least lowered its objections and allowed the final proposal to go through. And I think as how that sort of north-south or small-large debate ends up in Europe will determine much for how much we use data. And if you look, getting back to Estonia, Estonia is one. I wrote there were 1.5 million recently and got a call, no, they're only 1.3 million. If they're going to reach the larger market, they have to be more open with data and everything else. So I think they can use this data to digitally reach an entire market of 500 million. At least that's what they see as their hope.
Do you think?
I would just absolutely agree with Bill that in the things that he emphasizes on that, especially there's a natural thing in terms of the size, the population. It is easier to digitize a society of 1.3 than just in terms of cost and so that is one thing which is similar to the Danish one. I think one thing that we also do share is trust in government. We have a really, really high trust in authorities and government, which makes digitizing society a lot easier. And of course, the Estonians have a particular history also with the massive cyber attacks that they had to be into.
And they're big e-government.
So but that sort of kick-started. They had to do everything over and started digitizing everything. So that's one of the things. But just to say that In council, we work on the DSM as a whole quite closely in a broader, let's say, like-minded group, and that does encounter, let's say, all of the Nordics and Baltics, but it's also member states that you will find at the very bottom of the rankings. It's also Bulgaria. So being digitally ambitious doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be at the top of the ranks. It just means that you absolutely know, as Bill is saying, that to survive in the future or to excel in the future, you do have to not just get it, right or comply, you have to excel somehow. So I think that's very inspiring to see that a lot of member states who are not performing well at the moment are very ambitious, basically.
Trust in government is an interesting point to bring up because I mentioned that the correlation with income was not as strong as it first appears when you look at the top ranking countries. What surprised me was that the strongest correlation I found with the overall scores was with corruption, an inverse correlation. So the less corrupt a country is, the higher it scores. And it's a really tiny factor in the overall scores. We did take data from the Transparency International's Corruption's Perceptions Index, and the correlation between the CPI score and the overall score was something like 0.89. It was a really strong correlation. So I'm asking this question now, not because I think it might be entertaining for the audience, but because I don't really know the answer either. Is what's the real relationship between clean government and performance and all these factors? I mean, also I suppose the other point that you mentioned was that these. You talked about the European fringe, and I think you meant the northern fringe. I've just drawn.
I would say the Baltics and Benelux too.
I've just drawn a line on the map, so that the countries that performed high, and it's basically is the northern fringe of Europe, and what they all have in common, including Estonia, is fairly clean government, which unfortunately is not quite the case with South and Southeastern Europe. Now, it could be that this is one of those spurious correlations that get shared on social media, but does the panel think there may be something in this in terms of the efficacy and cleanliness of government having an impact on data economy?
It seems you're the one who's done the correlation.
Exactly. I think actually that's
that
is an interesting discovery, and I think this is something that should help to really look for more data, more information to assess, what is behind that. But that's clearly an indication that trust and transparency is, and we were talking about again artificial intelligence before. That's a key aspect of the data economy. So of course this is a very strong statement, but it's very much behind that data or that information that you have found out. But of course I think it's just the data is interesting. Now it requires more detailed assessment of what is behind.
No, and I'd also say, it's interesting that if you look at the countries that have promoted free expression online, it's the Netherlands, Sweden, and Estonia were the founders of the Freedom Online Coalition, and I think the pressures for full disclosure versus the idea of right to be forgotten, for example, are perceived differently in Sweden than in Southern Europe.
Anna mentioned transparency. We had two transparency indicators on this, open data and freedom of information. And open data was interesting because basically, well, I say interesting, European performance across the board was not very good. The highest ranking country was, by the way, we used the data for open data we took from the Open Data Barometer, and it's on page 22 if you want to see the scores. So as you can see, the UK gets 100, which is the maximum possible score, and this is a composite of two sub-scores that are provided by the Open Data Barometer. So the UK was number one globally. And in second place is France. This is second place in the EU. I can't remember where it appears in the global rankings, but it's much further behind. As you can see from the numbers, there's a 23-point gap, almost 23-point gap between the two. And then Spain in third is quite a long way behind France. This is more obvious actually if you look at the global rankings that the Open Data Barometer had, where you have the UK on top, you have the United States a close second, and then as you go into the third and fourth, the rankings just sort of get further and further behind. So in other words, Europe's not doing too well on open data. And my question is this a role for the European Union? Is this a sign for greater transparency regulation at EU level?
So, I mean, just to give one example, I remember when I worked at Google that one of the things Google wanted to do was put data from local metros and the tube in London and the metro in Paris and so forth in real time. And it had to negotiate deals with every different city, country, where the rules were different. And I could see the place for a European rule which saying that all this data collected by government agencies or travel agencies should be open and given, allowed everyone to access to work on it. I mean, the immediate impact in your ability to see when the next bus is going to come. But now, I mean, they had to hire different people to go into every country, negotiate every database, and so forth. It took years, and it remains very spotty.
Yeah.
If you look at the Google Maps.
I mean, I think local open data is a problem almost everywhere. In terms of access to data in sort of local infrastructure is a problem. I think that even the leading countries, the majority of the data that we're talking about is national government. It's data published by the national government. It's not local transport data, because I mean there's issues around sort of there's investment problems in local transport. Who pays for the census to be put in, and who has the right to use
Well,
and exploit
often it
the
was
data?
seen as if you were the tube, you wanted people to go to your website, not to some other website that was using your data. But that obviously wasn't giving the best, I think, results either for the users or for the bunch of companies that might have been able to crunch it and use it in a more effective, innovative way.
So is this something that the Commission should be looking at? I mean, I didn't mention at the start, we were due to have a speaker from the European Commission. Unfortunately, he fell ill yesterday, and Anna very kindly agreed to take his place at the 11th hour. So we're grateful for that. So unfortunately, he's not here to give his opinion on this, but I think if I could put it this way, if any of you were policymakers at the Commission and you were looking at open data performance in Europe, would you consider a regulatory measure a regulatory proposal on open data, or is this something that is best left to the member states?
Well, just to say, I don't know if I would answer it such a way. I wanted to just say that the public sector information directive is in place, so that is with the intent to make public sector information available. So that's one measure that's already in place. As I understand, the Commission will put forward propose a revision of that will go further. So they are looking at, I don't know how that will work out, but as I understand, they will be looking at a reverse mechanism saying privately owned data that is of public interest should be made available. So I don't know what legally,
That's more
I don't
controversial.
know, but this is at least something that they're looking at to try and make more data.
I mean, I know I could be wrong about this. I mean, I always know I could be wrong about anything, but the PSI directive, as I understand it, largely governs that when you publish data, it's about the reuse rights that you have to grant to third parties. But it doesn't actually say government has to have an open data by default policy, does it? Which I think is more where my thinking was going. I'm mindful of the fact that you have to leave in 5 minutes. and then I'll open up for questions from the audience. So I was going to get in one.
Can I just comment
yes,
very
please
quickly
do.
on this point? And I just want to touch that it's not all about the regulation. That I think what the European Union could also support the member states is what is the value that I'm going to get from this open data. So if they really offer more measures to experiment with that data, to make sure that's going to create more startups, more value to citizens. And also if there is a way to show that with more interoperability, cross-border collaboration, SMEs generating solutions based on open data can scale easily in Europe. So I think that also helps governments to open up data. I think, again, regulation might be needed, but I think it's not all about regulation. Sometimes you need to really offer other measures for people to understand the value created, and that will create the demand that it can help some countries to really push that paradigm.
I've got a specific question to you actually on open data. So the two indicators that we took from the Open Data Barometer were the implementation score, which looks at the extent to which governments are publishing data and the extent to which that data follows the open data principles. And then the second one we looked at was impact. So this is where they've done research on the extent to which the data is being used by businesses, by non-profit organisations. And what was interesting was there was actually quite a discrepancy between the two figures. You would expect them to be very closely aligned because the more data there is, the more opportunities there are to reuse it. But what we found was there were countries that were doing not so well on publishing it, but had higher reuse scores, which suggests that there is more to it than simply publishing data. So what should governments be doing, one, assuming the data is there and assuming the data is good, what should they be doing to encourage reuse of it? This is...
of course, yeah, and I see it's true. It doesn't need to be directly correlated. I mean, you need availability of data to generate value, but you need to put extra measures. So I think what really can help is access to more experimentation for startups and companies, and to really stimulate measures for the usage of that data and to support data startups working in the open data domain. So I think there is a lot of programs working around smart cities and other, in geospatial and earth observation. So there are programs stimulating the use and reuse of that data. I think still more is needed. And I think one more thing, open data, one thing that is really important to understand, data generates more value when it's aggregated with other data. So it's not about open data, private data. I mean, the value and everything that has to be with trust, transparency, it has to be also how that data is aggregated, how the data is changing along the value chain. And the whole thing of trust and transparency is not only about the source, of course, that's super important, but it's also what is happening in each of the steps, how this data is mixed with this data. When the data gets here, how can I trace back, where the data is coming from, etc., etc. So open data combined with other sources of information, private data, or it can actually generate extraordinary value. And we need to, I think, measures in member states to stimulate this kind of experimentation and measures to get more data entrepreneurs and startups experimenting with these diverse types of data is very important. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to open up to the floor. I know Christina unfortunately needs to be in council, but thank you very much for joining the panel.
I'm happy to answer a quick question, otherwise I'm going to go and then test my...
Any questions specifically for Christina, the Danish permanent representation?
All right.
I think that's true. I think the only way for you to get out is this way. I had to position all this so that we could get everything on the camera.
I'm going to go here.
So
well, thank you very
you
much.
can get out that way.
I have one, so I'm going to leave the rest there.
Great. I forgot to mention at the start actually, we are filming this, but you should not, maybe if you're in the front row you might be just about visible on the camera, but if you're uncomfortable with that, you can talk to me afterwards. But I've noticed the room has filled up quite a bit during the discussion, which is great to see. I also noticed that our media partner has joined us. I forgot to mention in our introduction. But EU Observer did help us with promoting this, so big thanks to them. So we've got about half an hour for questions from the floor. So if anybody would like to kick us off, if not, I've got loads more questions.
Yes, I have one.
Please, and please give us your name and where you work for. And just because I can't quite see it, is it okay if you stand up to ask if you're at the back? Thank you.
Anna Maria Zola, working for DGRTD. Can you spell out, you were saying that both of you were talking about the importance of trust and transparency for the open data economy. Can you spell out exactly what do you mean? I'm a sociologist, so I would like to understand better the sociological component of this debate. Thank you.
Okay.
No, because I can't speak in sociology.
Well, I cannot speak as an expert in sociology. First, it's not about open data, it's trust and transparency in the data economy in general. So that has a lot of dimensions. So for instance, trust in the source of data. So is the quality of the data good enough or is not? Or is the data, are we using in real time data that comes from 3 days ago? You know, and are we making decisions in data? Can I trust this data to make decisions that really are going to influence people's lives? That could be, for instance, a very good way to identify that. And again, that's not related only to the source, but data is transformed as we go through the different layers of aggregation, analytics, etc. So how can you trust also the algorithms that are using that data, for instance, or how that data is aggregated with other data, and again, the sources of the trust on those sources of data. And that's in relation to the trust. I think transparency is the possibility to trace everything and really look for, you know, where again the data is coming from, what is aggregated, what algorithms are we using. Can we really make sure that the algorithms are using the regulations that are made to use, or are just doing other things? Or so that's about transparency, to be able to really open the box and to look inside. And then again, because when we talk about data, it's much more, the value chain is really complex and it has a lot of loops of, you know, or to give you another example with artificial intelligence, it's all about training machines. It's giving huge amount of data for training. So, and I think everybody has seen on the news how some of these bots or robots, you know, they now have you know, some sex orientation, some, you know, because the data that we use to train them might be already biased. So how, and that's of extreme importance, how to define the data that is training. It's like education for kids now. The data for the data for training artificial intelligence is extremely also important to assess where it's coming from and how we trust that data. So there are, I think, so many dimensions to look at that. I don't think it's a simple answer, but I hope I gave you some good examples.
I was going to say, in answering sociological questions, there's a really useful amusing article you can find online, the Sociology to Economics phrase book. It's very entertaining. When a sociologist says social group, an economist is a group of friendly students.
What if you added EU speaker to it?
Yeah, you would
Really
need
good,
a column. Any other questions?
Sorry, just one more thing. This is, I think, looking from the sociological point of view, I think it's also this kind of trust from society towards not understanding what all this means. So I think also the educational aspect of the data economy, and not only in the master, for new masters in data science, but really to bring in data knowledge to everyone, I think that's very important, because it's a question of understanding a bit what's going on.
No, because indeed the word trust, I mean, was a bit sort of raising some question for me, because, but the way the explanation you give is almost the opposite. I mean, because you are questioning the tools that we are using to check if they are really able to extract the information which are relevant. So there was a bit of misunderstanding for me, because trust is having trust means being confident about this information. While you were saying exactly the opposite, that we are questioning if the data that we're extracting are the right one, if they're relevant, or about algorithms, because I heard these stories that the algorithms used by Google are racist because they were sending specific messages to some black African population in the States, for example, about legal support in case of legal troubles. So basically the algorithm was identifying certain surnames which had African origins, and especially these people were receiving messages on the offer of support in legal issues. And that's, that was quite a shocking story for me to see that, because actually the researcher who analyzed this issue, she has an African surname, African origin surname, but of course, and she was at the same time a researcher, so she got really intrigued about why was she receiving all these advertisements.
And I think that's a question of transparency, and to be able to look back and see
Exactly.
why it is happening and why I'm receiving this. So that's and one thing is linked to the other. But of course, if you start receiving those messages, you stop trusting something. Also, you don't understand why that is happening. So it all makes this.
I think one of the interesting points with artificial intelligence, I'm probably sort of speaking less as I'm abusing my position as chair and behaving like a panelist, but there is a distinction, I think, between the trust of process and the trust of outcomes. As an analogy, I don't understand how paracetamol works. I don't know why it fixes my headache, but I know that usually it does fix my headache. I trust the outcomes of it. The processes, I would probably have to go and study, I don't know, biomedical science or something to understand. Now with algorithms, and you mentioned sort of racial bias in algorithms as well, I think we have kind of there's a similar problem there, in that I think you can decide whether an algorithm is making racist decisions by looking at its aggregate behavior. And I mean, I think a better example than the case you mentioned would be I think, was it Microsoft launched an AI-driven chatbot on Twitter that within a matter of hours was racially abusing people and just saying the most hideous things it could, because it was learning from how other people tweet. And because no one had told this algorithm, don't emulate racists in this. This is just what it did, because it doesn't understand. It doesn't know that that what it's repeating was horrific. And this, I suspect, is also what lay behind the example you gave of the advertising algorithm that was racially profiling people, because it had never been told not to do that. And earlier on, Bill mentioned the right to
another example. The issue, though, is many of these same issues, we struggle to deal with them offline. And online, it presents a lot of the same ethical dilemmas. I remember when Google had a project called Google Suggest, and it was used for mobile phones because you didn't have to type everything in. It would suggest what you were looking for. And in France, it seemed that every politician, if you put his name in, the thing it would suggest is he Jewish, juif. And there was a suit about this, and Google ended that sort of automatic link between the two. But now, this wasn't a sort of mean algorithm that was it was just what actually our society, that's what people were looking for, and so it replicated that and duplicated it. And I think some of these illnesses that we're trying to deal with aren't unique to the internet, but go to deeper issues. How do we deal with anti-Semitism today?
I mean, it's like some of the other issues. I mean, you also mentioned sort of fake news and censorship and these kinds of things. That we're trying to deal with things that basically reflect the worst instincts in humans, racism being one of them, and we don't like what we see. So we want to sort of deal with the algorithm, perhaps because it's a way of sort of.
Well, I think the larger question is we're seeing a rise in populism throughout the world.
Yeah.
Okay, move to the extremes in the democratic countries, and how, I mean, what's the role, I mean, what is the responsibility of the internet in that? It's often been that the problem is the internet, whereas I'd say the problem is what the president is tweeting or doing on the internet, or you know, what British politicians did in Brexit and so forth. And I mean, I really do believe that looking at the internet or the distributor trying to throttle that isn't going to resolve the issue.
Well, what I was getting at between this thing of process and outcomes was that if you want to decide whether an algorithm is racist, you can look at its outcomes. But the emphasis in the EU with the GDPR is not on the outcomes, it's on the process. It's this, you know, if you're an individual, you have a right to have an algorithmic decision explained to you, which won't necessarily tell you whether that algorithm is racist or not, because it only relates to your particular decision, your particular data. It doesn't tell you whether the algorithm is making racist decisions on aggregate. So, you know, you mentioned those you know, black families who were being shown adverts that were targeted towards them. If they asked for an explanation of that algorithm, if one from that group, to be specific, asked for an individual asked for an explanation, that it wouldn't necessarily say, we showed you this advert because we racially profiled you. It would say, because we drew on all these different data points that may not in themselves individually point directly to race, and we did it on the basis of that. And it would only be when we looked at the aggregate result of the algorithm that we realized, well, this algorithm is racially profiling people. So this was kind of what I was getting at with sort of the regulatory side of algorithmic bias, where we've got the balance wrong.
Well, I think the big regulatory question around these issues is going to be the liability regime and what will happen to the user-generated content, who's responsible for it, and what rules are put on it. And this is going to be a debate that's going to go on for several years, because now the platforms are only responsible for removing it, not from preventing it from getting up online. There's a lot of talk about whether that's the right balance, right responsibility, and I think the risk is that we go to something where we privatize the censorship regime and make the incentives so that stuff doesn't get online, to the point that a lot of good stuff doesn't get online too. So we'll see. But looking forward, I would think that would have a lot to determine whether Europe sort of continues to allow data, good and bad, whether it be, in this case, sort of speech, to be seen and debated, or whether it tries to suppress it.
I mean, I can't remember whether it's the Commission has just published its draft of its proposals on
Notice and take
platform
down.
liability and I mean, unfortunately, I was so tied up with finalising this, I didn't have time to read it in detail.
I think that's just the beginning of the debate. I mean, I think we're going to see national governments taking laws that, I mean, the law in Germany against Facebook, which would impose large fines for allowing fake news, who determines what's fake news, but that is an answer, and so forth. So I think national governments are moving ahead, and the Commission is just one voice in this debate.
And that's another sort of indicator that might have been useful, perhaps in our libel chill section. That you know, it wasn't available. Would have been, you know, whether a country has laws specific to platforms. So we've got. I mean, in many countries, laws against hate speech are usually part of defamation law. You can defend.
I mean, there's another debate that's going on. France has something called the loi numérique, which has been passed but not implemented yet, which gets to the question of what TripAdvisor should do, the rights of restaurant owners to seek redress against TripAdvisor and so forth. At this point, there's mostly more transparency. TripAdvisor has to give more information to the supplier of the restaurant owner. But I think that's a big debate that's undecided yet, how far that will go, and what would be the right balance between platform. The risk is then that you try to correct the redress and give the restaurant owners so many rights that platforms, only the richest platforms will be able to comply, and it'll sort of stifle innovation, or that you get the balance so wrong that platforms start either be afraid to take off sellers of counterfeit goods because the risks of the counterfeiter being able to come back and claim rights. So we will see. There's supposedly a proposal due by the end of the year.
And even if the platforms are rich enough to comply, doesn't mean they have an incentive.
Well, I mean, it was just the compliance cost.
Sorry, I meant to talking about to resist cases to shut these down.
And I would like to add something to this, because I think it's very important what you are saying now. In particular, because we are talking about regulation in platforms that we know, and we know the effect that they are already having in our economy, and so there is some kind of need of regulating to stop something based on something that we know. But we need to also think the things that are coming up that still we don't know well, like we are talking about autonomous cars and all these things that also came with in terms of the communication for the new.
So if I was to use a specific example, look at messaging services, WhatsApp, she's just left it, but WhatsApp or Skype, and look at what's happening in China with WeChat. I mean, WeChat is a messaging device that is basically become a new platform where you can buy things on WeChat, you can trade things, you can post things. Basically, it's a giant new platform to conduct much of your online life. Well, I mean, if Europe goes ahead and regulates these messaging services like telephone services, which is the direction we're headed, I don't think it'll be easy to add these extra services. Or use data if you want to come back to, if you're a telephone service, you have strict requirements on how you handle data and strict requirements and privacy that go beyond. So that's what I would see the risks.
Yeah. But also there will be more and more services, business to business, that maybe are not so clear to the public, and then new rules. Like I heard examples, and I don't know how true they are, that for instance in the agri-food sector, where the whole data economy is really popping up, a company like Monsanto, when selling the seeds, was asking the farmers, but you need to give me your data. And these kind of things. No? So this is the kind of things that maybe now at the beginning we say, okay, this is not so important, but I think protect the farmer and protect, okay, who has the right, why we are giving directly the right to the seed provider, we are giving all the power. So I think this is the kind of things that are new, is the new things that are coming up with the data economy, where we really need to look at and and to do as much experimentation up front, and to do this kind of policy experimentation grounds, where okay, this is coming up, let's experiment with it from the more research and innovation perspective and assess what are the barriers that really the players are finding in this experiment, and let's try to regulate depending on what's going on. I think that's something that we believe could bring some value. And also positive, thinking about positive future a bit.
There's a question here at the back.
Good morning, my name is Olivier Servet, and I'm here in dual capacity. First is to transpose here in the EU an initiative that led to an act signed by President Obama a few years ago. The second, I'm a part-time in a company developing AI algorithms. But our focus in this company is text, not numeric data. In your report, are you making any difference, distinction between text and numeric data?
In this report, we're using indicators on countries' performance, so I don't think we had anything on. No, we didn't have any indicator that would make a distinction between textual analysis and data analysis. However, we have done work on text and data mining tools, such as those that are sometimes applied to academic research, which is another area of
Well, it's right, it's being debated right now in the
Yeah.
copyright, the new copyright law, where public institutions would be allowed to reuse
profit
data,
making institutions.
but profit making, private companies would not. So your company would be out of luck. You'd have to pay an extra license to get data that, you know, the university would.
Or to analyze data you already have.
Yeah,
I mean, if you went through it all with a pen and paper and just spent kind of years picking out these little details with brain power alone, you would not be in breach of copyright rules. But if you had a computer do it for you, you'd be breaching copyright. I don't know if this is the kind of issue you were thinking about, but this is something that we've looked at specifically in the question of mining, separating out text mining from data mining. Although I think, I mean, it applies to numeric data as well.
I think so. I think it, I mean, you know, I think this is another one of those questions where regulation will determine much of what Europe is able to do or not do. And, you know, copyright versus as a right balanced against the rights of the user or the innovator is a balance where I fear Europe is going much more towards the copyright holders than anywhere else. But, yeah. Let's see as that piece of legislation makes its way through.
It's both an advantage in a case of doing a report like this, is you can end up having a discussion on almost any data policy issue that there is in Brussels now, as usually we do sort of focus on specific issues. So having said that, means if there's anything anyone here has an axe to grind about, now is your opportunity to bring it up. I mean, Bill also mentioned the TripAdvisor reviews and the restaurants that might not look like being in the bottom rankings. So obviously, if we're ranking the member states, that means somebody has to be at the bottom. So if any of you are from any of those countries, please don't take it personally. There's some countries here in the lower rankings that I've spent a lot of time in and I'm very fond of. It's a purely numeric calculation. If not, I think we can wrap it up because we've only got the room for about another 5 minutes and then I have to clear it out. Please do drop your business cards into the box by the camera over there. We'd be very grateful. Because we'd like to keep in touch and keep you up to date on our work. Please take the copies of the report with you because otherwise I will have to carry them all back and I don't want it. And thank you very much for joining us.